fighting for equal protection through the courts. Laws as fierce as tigers, Chinese and the courts. Did early Chinese immigrants have equal protection under the law? Were the laws equitable? Chinese in America during the 19th century repeatedly used the United States judicial system to fight racist laws and unjust actions. Part 1. Chinese men first came to California in large numbers in 1849 and in the 1850s during the gold rush. Most came from the Canton area of southern China. And when they arrived at the gold fields, they came across the first example of unfair laws, the foreign miners' taxes. The foreign miners' tax, 1850, was for $20 a month on foreign miners. However, it was mostly a tax on Chinese, Mexicans, and South Americans. White European foreigners were not taxed. $20 is worth about $650 today. Few Chinese could pay that much. Moreover, they were often cheated by fake tax collectors and thieves. Many left the gold fields with broken dreams. The next governor agreed $20 was too much, and he repealed the tax. Then there was another new governor and another tax. The foreign miners' license tax, 1852, was for $3 a month, and in 1853 it increased to $4. In 1855 it became $5. That's $143 in today's money. Taxes from the Chinese miners were more than 10% of the revenues of the California government. That's a lot of money for a state that didn't protect them. Another tax, another attempt to stop Chinese immigration. A victory for a Chinese man who went to court. The California legislature passed an 1862 police tax of $2.50 a month on most Chinese laborers. It was entitled An Act to Protect Free White Labor Against Chinese Coolie Labor and Discourage the Immigration of the Chinese into the state of California. The tax was challenged by Lin Sing, who paid the tax, but brought a lawsuit to get a refund. His case went up to the California Supreme Court, Lin Sing versus Washburn. The court said California could not tax Chinese immigrants. States did not have power over immigration. The tax was repealed. Lin Sing got his refund. Lin Sing versus Washburn was the first case in which a Chinese resident in the United States sought the overturn of a state law on the grounds that it violated the Constitution or laws of the United States. It would not be the last. A second wave of Chinese workers came to America from 1865 to 1869. More than 12,000 Chinese immigrants helped build the western part of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Central Pacific Railroad. At times, they were 90% of the workforce. They worked hard for lower wages than other workers. But when the railroad was finished in 1869, many white workers wanted the Chinese to leave. The economy was getting worse, and many people were out of work. Anti-Chinese feelings grew. White workmen formed a workingmen's party that called for exclusion. The Chinese must go. Racism was written into law in 1879. California's second constitution. Members of the Workingmen's Party got this anti-Chinese article included. 1. The state legislature had authority to protect state, counties, and cities from the Chinese who were seen as dangerous and undesirable. 2. Corporations were forbidden to hire Chinese. 3. Chinese were forbidden to work on public works projects. 4. Cities and towns were able to remove Chinese out of the city or town limits or into certain neighborhoods. Laws that came from Article 19 were quickly struck down in federal courts, which ruled the laws violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection, violated the rights due to Chinese immigrants under treaty, and violated corporations' rights. That did not end the era of anti-Chinese activism or legislation, of course. State and local governments continued to pass new laws to harass and hinder Chinese residents, many of which were unenforceable or were found to violate the United States Constitution. And then Congress, responding to the continuing anti-Asian agitation, passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Part 2. Could whites get away with murder? Did Chinese lives matter? In 1853, a white miner, George Hall, and his brother assaulted and robbed a Chinese miner. Another Chinese miner, Lin Sing, heard this from his tent and tried to help his fellow Chinese miner. Unfortunately, Lin Sing was shot and killed by Hall. Hall was arrested, and a judge in San Francisco sentenced Hall to hang based on the testimony of Chinese witnesses. That sounds like justice, right? George Hall and his lawyer appealed the verdict. They argued that the testimony of the Chinese witnesses should be barred, just like the use of testimonies by blacks, mulattoes, mixed race, and Indians against whites. The case went to the California Supreme Court. You be the judge. Should Chinese be barred from testifying? People versus Hall, 1854. The decision. In 1854, the California State Supreme Court categorized Chinese with blacks and Indians and denied Chinese the right to testify against whites in a court of law. Hall was freed of the murder charges because some of the witnesses were Chinese. Chinese had no right to testify in court. And another case, the Brady decision of 1869, also said Chinese could not testify against whites. Even more telling about the Supreme Court's decision is the justice's view of what might happen if Chinese could testify. Is this racism? Chief Justice Murray. The same rule which would admit them to testify would admit them to all the equal rights of citizenship. He wrote, "We would soon see them at the polls, in the jury box, upon the bench, and in the legislative halls. This is not a speculation which exists in the excited and overheated imagination of the patriot and statesman, but it is an actual and present danger." He considered the Chinese a race nature has marked as inferior, incapable of progress or intellectual development. In other words, the Supreme Court justice tried to exclude Chinese from courts because it might lead to full participation in California democracy. Racial exclusion laws were used across the United States to leave whites in a position of power within the legal system. What was the effect of this decision on the Chinese? Look at this political cartoon. It shows a white man representing California harassing and violently beating a Chinese man. The courts of justice were closed to them. The People versus Hall decision greatly increased violence by whites against Chinese. Because the Chinese and African Americans and Indians couldn't testify against whites, whites could get away with murder and other crimes if the only witnesses were not white. The decision was broadly criticized. African American civil rights leaders like Frederick Douglass objected. In his newspaper, a black reporter said, "It was unjust and un-American to treat Chinese as subhumans. and the Chinese have taken the place of the colored people as victims of oppression. 1854. Samuel Clemens Mark Twain wrote in 1871, "Any white man can swear a Chinaman's life away in the courts, but no Chinaman can testify against a white man." As I write, news come that in broad daylight in San Francisco, some boys have stoned an inoffensive Chinaman to death, and that although a large crowd witnessed the shameful deed, no one interfered. We Chinese are viewed like thieves and enemies. Pun Chi, a young Chinese merchant, appealed to Congress to protect the rights of Chinese, circa 1860. Your Supreme Court has decided that the Chinese shall not bring action or give testimony against white men. To the death of how many of us has it led? In cases that are brought before your officers of justice, inasmuch as we are unable to obtain your people as witnesses, even the murderer is immediately set free. It is a small thing with them to drive us away and seize our property. They proceed to do violence and kill us. They go on in a career of bloodshed without limit, since they find there are none to bear testimony against them. What became of this offensive law? The 14th Amendment was passed in July 1868. While originally written to protect the newly freed African Americans from slavery, it also benefited the Chinese in future court cases. It said in the Equal Protection Clause, all persons, not all citizens, had rights. And so, it was argued, all people had the right to testify in a court of law. Jurors and judges would weigh what they heard from all witnesses. The 14th Amendment overrode the decision in People v. Hall, and Chinese, Black, and Indian witnesses were finally allowed to testify in court against whites. In 1872, the California legislature finally repealed their law and eliminated it from the Penal Code. However, equal rights under the law were still a long way away. But even after Chinese could testify in court, that didn't mean a jury would believe them. On the evening of September 15, 1903, a group of at least 30 men from the Tonopah Nevada Labor Union marched into Tonopah's Chinese community and ordered the residents to leave. A few hours later, a smaller group began breaking into every Chinese-occupied house. They pistol-whipped anyone who resisted and ransacked the homes, searching for money and valuables. Some of the more prominent Chinese merchants were marched out of town and beaten. One was killed. The man, Zhang Bingliang, had lived in the United States for more than 30 years. Many of the Chinese and several white residents of the town came forth to identify those who took part in the riot, and 17 men were initially arrested. Only 6 men were charged with assault and murder. The case was tried before the grand jury for 5 days in December 1903. One lawyer for the defense talked for a long time on labor conditions and the Chinese question at the trial, even though it was not relevant to a murder case. Despite the eyewitness accounts of Zhang Baiwei and the other witnesses, a verdict of not guilty for each of the 6 men was returned by the jury after 1 hour and 15 minutes. The crowded courtroom was filled with the wildest enthusiasm when the verdict was read. The Reno Evening Gazette of December 15, 1903 commented, "The evidence against them was complete. Before any jury of intelligent and unbiased men anywhere in this country, a conviction would have been a certainty. The men who committed the crime were all known, and they are now all enjoying liberty." Did Chinese lives matter? More violence erupted. 1877 riot in San Francisco. The 1870s were a time of great economic problems. The country was deep into the Long Depression, and San Francisco was hit hard. The Bank of California failed. Unemployment was about 20%. Thousands were being fed daily by churches and charities. And white working men found a scapegoat, the Chinese, and a leader, Dennis Kearney, who led a working men's party. He gave speeches against the rich who hired the Chinese and against Chinese laborers. Every speech ended with, "The Chinese must go." In 1877, the workmen turned into a mob. A riot of destruction and violence lasted 4 days. Chinese-owned property was destroyed. 4 men were killed. At last, the riot was controlled by the police and more than 1,000 public safety volunteers. On October 31st, 1880, there was an anti-Chinese race riot in Denver that left businesses and residences destroyed in Denver's Chinatown. One man, Luk Young, was beaten to death and then hanged. Many others were injured. None of the over $50,000 of damage and property was reimbursed. The riot was sparked by a bar fight in a pool hall between 2 Chinese men and 4 white men. The fight poured into the streets and alleys of downtown Denver. Within a couple of hours, thousands of white folks stormed through the Chinatown, busting in windows and chasing the Chinese out. June 2nd, 1884. The El Paso Daily Times reported that an Irish railroad worker, Paddy O'Rourke, killed a Chinese railroad worker. A mob of O'Rourke supporters surrounded Bean's court and threatened to lynch him if he didn't free O'Rourke. After looking through his law book, Judge Roy Bean said homicide was killing of a human being. He ruled that he'd be damned if he could find any law against killing a Chinaman and dismissed the case. O'Rourke was freed. Across Texas, it was often said, "West of the Pecos River, there is no law. West of El Paso, there is no God." Anti-Chinese violence flared in Seattle and Tacoma, Washington, 1886. The Knights of Labor, a white union, forcibly ejected more than 200 Chinese laborers from Seattle. They helped ignite a riot in which the United States Army was called in to quell the violence, and United States troops patrolled the streets for 10 days. In nearby Tacoma, an angry mob expelled the Chinese and burned their Chinatown to the ground. Congress paid $276,619 to the Chinese government in compensation for the rioting, but the actual victims never saw any compensation. Though 13 white men were tried in court for the riot, not a single one was ever convicted of a crime. Anti-Chinese violence flared in Wyoming, September 2nd, 1885. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, 28 Chinese men were killed, shot, burned to death, some mutilated, 15 or more wounded, homes and businesses burned, resulting in approximately $150,000 in property damage, equal to $4.27 million in 2020 dollars. After the riot in Rock Springs, 16 men were arrested. The men were taken to jail, where they were held until after a county grand jury refused to bring indictments, an accusation of a crime. We have diligently inquired into the occurrence at Rock Springs. Though we have examined a large number of witnesses, no one has been able to testify to a single criminal act committed by any known white person that day. Those arrested as suspects in the riot were released a little more than a month later. On their release, they were met by several hundred men, women, and children and treated to a regular ovation, according to the New York Times. No person was ever convicted in the violence at Rock Springs. Cartoonist Thomas Nast has 2 Chinese diplomats satirically state, "There's no doubt of the United States being at the head of enlightened nations." The riots were not only outrageous, They were an international embarrassment. There were more than 153 cases of racial violence in the West during the 1870s to 1890s, including in Los Angeles and San Jose. Part 4. Exclusion Laws. California's attempt at exclusion laws. The Page Act, 1875. The Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. The Scott Act, 1888. The Geary Act, 1892. This political cartoon shows the racist attitudes toward Chinese immigration in the 1870s and 1880s. What are the symbols in the cartoon? Who is that woman and what does she symbolize? Is the cartoonist sympathetic or critical of the Chinese immigrant? California tried to stop the immigration of Chinese laborers on its own. The California legislature took up a bill in 1858 to stop immigration. They claimed the right to exclude persons they thought detrimental to their welfare. Their habits, manners, and appearance are disgusting in the extreme. And it compared their influx to a visitation by the locusts of Egypt. The committee said that California was the country of the white man and that we should exclude the inferior races. The legislation was called an act to prevent the further immigration of Chinese or Mongolians into the state, 1858. The bill was enacted into law but was struck down by the California Supreme Court. Only Congress could regulate immigration. The Page Act, to end the danger of immoral Chinese women, cheap laborers, and other undesirables, 1875. The Page Act of 1875 was passed to stop the immigration of Chinese, Japanese, and Mongolian prostitutes, felons, criminals, and contract laborers. While it supposedly tried to prevent sex trafficking and coolie slave labor, it severely limited immigration of women who were wives of merchants. It also stereotyped Asian women who had to prove they were of good character to join their husbands. The law was an attempt to prevent Chinese from settling permanently in the United States. In 1882, Congress passed the Exclusion Act that excluded any additional Chinese immigrant workers. But there were many exemptions. Businessmen, students, teachers, and diplomats from China could still come. Tourists in transit were allowed in. So were people who claimed to have been here before and had returned certificates, which were without a photograph. The Exclusion Act was like a wall trying to keep Chinese workers out of the United States. But it can also be described as a door, but a door that was kept ajar. Custom officials and shipping companies were afraid of denying anyone a landing. Had we refused to bring them, our steamers would be barred from the China trade. It was Congress's expansionist dream with China trade that opened the door to these exemptions, and now United States businessmen successfully lobbied to keep the door ajar. The Scott Act in 1888 stopped the re-entry of Chinese back into America who had gone home to visit their families in China. This cartoon shows Chinese entering the United States from Canada and Mexico, both of which had Chinese exclusion acts of their own. A challenge to the Scott Exclusion Act, Che Chanping versus United States, 1888. Che Chanping came to California in 1875, but left for China in 1887. He had a laborer's return certificate. He left China for San Francisco on September 7, 1888, and was at sea when the Scott Act went into effect. He had no notice of its passage. Would you let him back in? You be the judge. China and the United States had a treaty, which is like a contract between two governments. The treaty gave Cha Chan-ping rights. Cha Chan-ping was on his way back to the United States when it went into effect. He had his return certificate, which is like a contract between a person and the United States. What would you decide? To a courtroom packed with both white and Chinese spectators, Judge Sawyer ruled. He said the certificate was not a contract, it was only evidence of identity. He said that congressional law had more power than a treaty. And he said that a change in public policy could happen at any time. Cha Chan-ping could not re-enter the United States. According to the San Francisco Call newspaper, the Chinese who heard the ruling met it with weeping and wailing. Their hope for a change in the Exclusion Act was killed. Upon appeal to the United States Supreme Court, the court upheld the decision. No Chinese laborers had returned rights once he had departed. However, in other cases later brought to court, the Supreme Court ruled that Chinese merchants were not restricted by the Scott Act. They could re-enter the United States. Wong Kim Ark also wanted to return to San Francisco. His lawsuit made history. United States versus Wong Kim Ark, 1898. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco in 1873. After a trip to China, he was denied re-entry to the United States under a law restricting Chinese immigration and prohibiting immigrants from China from becoming naturalized United States citizens. He challenged the government's refusal to recognize his citizenship and allow him back to his home. Wong Kim Ark. But I was born in San Francisco in 1873. I'm a citizen. Let me back in. Wong Kim Ark, 1898. This case went to the United States Supreme Court. In 1898, the Supreme Court ruled in his favor under the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause. Anyone born in the United States is a citizen. It is called a landmark case because it is so important. The decision is used to support many other court cases. This had implications for all Chinese who were born in the United States. They were citizens too. And it has implication for today, especially with many children of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or Dreamers. Geary Act, 1892. In 1892, the Chinese Exclusion Act was renewed as the Geary Act. Chinese were required to have identification papers, an ID that showed their address and occupation. Without this ID, they could be deported. These required a photograph. After the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, Chinese immigration dropped from 39,500 in 1882 to just 10 persons 5 years later. Part 5. Anti-Asian Hate Crimes in Modern Times. Are Chinese and other minority groups protected by the law today? As you read about these events, think. What were the economic situations at that time? And was it like the time of racist attacks against the early immigrants in the West? What happened in the courts? How did people, Chinese and others, react to the verdicts? Was there some justice for the victims? Murder of Vincent Chin, 1982. A hate crime. Was there justice? 100 years after the passage of the Exclusion Act. On June 19, 1982, Vincent Chin, a 27-year-old Chinese American, went to a Detroit bar with 3 friends to celebrate his upcoming wedding. There, 2 unemployed white auto workers reportedly called him a Jap. One said, "It is because of you, Mother, that we're out of work." When the first fight broke out, the manager evicted them all. Once outside, the white men went to their car, took out a baseball bat from the trunk, and approached Chin and his companions who were in the parking lot. Chin and his friends started running. They were chased and finally trapped. One held Chin while the other beat him with the bat. 4 days later, Vincent died from several head injuries. Several hundred people, originally invited to Chin's wedding, instead attended his funeral. The 2 men pleaded guilty to manslaughter. One murderer was originally sentenced to 25 years in prison, but the conviction was overturned on appeal. They served no jail time, were given 3 years probation, and fined $3,000 and ordered to pay $780 in court costs. Later, a civil suit for the unlawful death of Vincent Chin was settled out of court in 1987. One was ordered to pay $50,000 to his family. The other was ordered to pay $1.5 million. Vincent's racially motivated murder in 1982 is widely considered the moment of political awakening for many Asian Americans. As we considered the death of George Floyd and a new wave of anti-Asian hate crimes, Asian American leaders recalled this case nearly 4 decades ago. Vincent Chin's death was a turning point for the Asian American community, said United States Representative Judy Chu, the first Chinese American woman to be elected to Congress. "We began organizing and fighting for change like never before." Recent hate crimes against Asians, some in San Francisco. Push down, hit, cut, name calling and the new call for exclusion. Property damage, attacked on Market Street, she fought back. Anti-Asian hate. "Too often we've turned against one another," said President Biden. Vicious hate crimes against Asian Americans who have been attacked, harassed, blamed, and scapegoated. They're forced to live in fear for their lives just walking down the streets in America. It's wrong, it's un-American, and it must stop. Recent anti-Asian hate crimes and support from the federal government. The United States Senate and the House of Representatives passed new legislation to combat rising anti-Asian hate crimes. Then it was signed into law by the president. And communities and people of all colors are coming together in support. If you are being called names or harassed because of the COVID-19 or racism, talk to someone about it. Incidents can be reported to Stop Asian American Pacific Islanders Hate. Taking cases to court today in San Francisco and getting help. Here are some resources. Laws as fierce as tigers. As we have seen, Chinese Americans in the 19th century repeatedly used the judicial system to fight racist laws and unjust actions. Today, Chinese, Blacks, Latinx, Pacific Islander Americans, and other minority groups still have many problems with equality in America. But thanks to the people who went to court in the past, things are much better. America may someday become a country where all people are equal. Read the poem on the next page to better understand the joys and hardships and courage that early Chinese immigrants felt coming to America. This poem was carved on the wall of the detention center on Angel Island. Just talk about going to the land of the flowery flag, and my countenance fills with happiness. Not without hard work were 1,000 pieces of gold dug up and gathered together. There were words of farewell to the parents, but the throat choked up first. There were many feelings, many tears flowing face to face when parting with the wife. Waves big as mountains often astonished this traveler. With laws harsh as tigers, I had a taste of all the barbarities. Do not forget this day when you land ashore. Push yourself ahead and do not be lazy or idle.